quiet welcome to Plotfall. Tonight, our story takes us into the world of why it sucked to be a medieval plague survivor. Before we begin, if you find value in these stories, perhaps take a quiet moment to like the video and subscribe. It helps others find the channel. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from and the time. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now, find a comfortable position, perhaps dim the lights or turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Imagine the morning light, not filtering through clean windows, but through a small, greased parchment opening high in a wall of wattle and daub. It's early. The air inside is cool and damp, carrying the faint mingled smells of wood smoke, sleeping bodies, and the ever-present earth floor. Outside, the village is just stirring. You hear the first crow of a rooster, sharp and clear in the quiet air. Then, perhaps the lowing of a cow being let out, the distant bleating of a sheep. Sounds familiar, dependable. Soon, the gentle scraping of a spade on dirt as someone begins their field work, or the rhythmic thud of a mortar and pestle from the miller. Life here moves at the pace of the sun and the seasons, slow and deeply predictable. The path outside is likely muddy, even on a dry morning, churned by feet and hooves. Smoke begins to curl lazily from thatched roofs, adding to the air thick with the scent of burning wood, damp straw, and the various smells of daily life. Livestock, cooking fires, the simple latrine pit. Each day is a repetition of the last, a small, contained world where change comes glacially, if at all. There's a quiet rhythm to it, a heavy, unchanging predictability that, for many, was simply the way the world was, always had been, and always would be. It felt permanent. Yes, that unchanging predictability. It wasn't just monotonous. It was, in a strange way, the anchor holding their world together. Life moved with the sun, a slow, predictable arc across the sky each day, dictating when you rose, when you ate, when you slept. Then the moon's quiet glow, guiding the shorter, colder hours. The passage of time wasn't marked by clocks or calendars as we know them, but by the deep, physical rhythm of the seasons. Spring meant the heavy, damp smell of turned earth, the creak of the plow, the shared labor of sowing seeds that held the promise of survival. Summer brought the relentless heat, the sweat and dust of the harvest fields, the rhythmic swing of sickles, and the quiet camaraderie of people working side by side under the vast sky. Autumn was the smell of wood smoke thickening, the feeling of crisp leaves underfoot, the urgent work of gathering, storing, and preparing for the long, dark winter ahead. This cycle, demanding and often brutal as it was, created a predictable flow. It gave life a sense of purpose, tied directly to the land and the collective effort of the community. Everyone had their part to play in this ancient, rolling rhythm. Knowing what came next, what was needed from you and your neighbors, provided a fundamental security, a steady drumbeat in a world that otherwise offered little ease. It felt eternal, this slow, gentle, relentless tide of life, bound to the earth. And this quiet, familiar world, this small corner of existence, it rarely stretched far beyond the edge of the nearest forest or the bend in the local river. Most villagers knew only their patch of soil. The next hamlet, perhaps a few miles away, maybe the market town if they were lucky enough to visit once a year. The sense that filled your days were wood smoke, damp earth, livestock, and the ever-present smell of your neighbors. The sounds were the wind in the trees, the bleating of sheep, the church bell marking the hours, and the quiet murmur of familiar voices. The feel was the rough fabric of your clothes, the calloused grip on tools, the cold mud underfoot, the warmth of the hearth fire. Your entire universe was likely just a few square miles, intimately known. News traveled slowly, if at all, across vast distances. Empires rose and fell thousands of miles away. Kingdoms battled, great cities thrived. But to most villagers, these were distant whispers, irrelevant concerns. Their worries were intensely local, rooted in the immediate realities of their lives. The health of the crops, the mood of the Lord, if little Thomas would survive the fever, whether the leaky roof would hold another winter storm. The world beyond the familiar paths was a vague, often frightening concept, populated by kings, castles, and perhaps even mythical creatures, mostly existing only in the rare stories told by a traveling peddler. Life was lived, day after predictable day, within the narrow, comfortable, sometimes terrifying confines of the place you were born. This insular existence, while limiting, paradoxically provided a strange, almost forgotten kind of security, until something truly unimaginable finally found its way to your doorstep. That quiet, predictable bubble couldn't last forever. Beyond the boundaries of your small, familiar world, faint whispers were already starting their journey, carried not just by the wind, but on the backs of weary camels in distant deserts, packed into the hulls of creaking ships traversing unknown seas, and clinging to the rough-spun clothes of merchants trading silks and spices in bustling, faraway ports you could only imagine. These weren't clear facts traveling the roads, but fragments, like dust motes catching the light. Tales of a strange sickness, far away in the east, spreading with terrifying speed. Stories of people falling ill suddenly, developing painful swellings and dying within days, sometimes hours. They sounded like exaggerated travelers' yarns, perhaps, the kind you'd hear spun by a peddler trying to seem important, but the hushed tones and the fear in their eyes were different. The rumors traveled slowly at first, filtering from city to town, village to village, like a creeping fog. A sailor might tell a dockworker, who told a carter, who mentioned it to a farmer near the market. The descriptions were vague, inconsistent, filtered through fear and distance. A sickness, from somewhere over the mountains, or perhaps across the water. It killed quickly, very quickly. It was unsettling, a prickle of unease disrupting the rhythm of the fields and the hearth. Something truly unknown was approaching, carried on threads of fear and distant trade. These weren't just rumors from the next village over. These were tales carried on ships from places far, far away. Whispers spoke of cities glittering with silks and spices, great trading hubs where paths from the edge of the known world converged. Places like Venice, where canals met the sea, or Genoa, perched on steep hills overlooking the vast Mediterranean, now seemed less like wonders and more like dangerous origins. The stories, often conflicting and fragmented, told of a strange illness appearing in these exotic lands. Accounts of people falling ill suddenly, struck down by a fever that burned them from within. Then came descriptions of terrifying swellings, dark and painful, appearing in the armpits or groin. Death was swift, shockingly so, reducing strong men and women to helpless victims in mere days, sometimes even hours. These were lands many would never see, filled with goods that arrived wrapped and mysterious, carrying the scent of cinnamon and pepper. Now, that very connection to the distant and exotic felt menacing. It was a sickness from somewhere else, somewhere wealthy and powerful, carried silently on the currents of trade that linked their small world to the grand, terrifying unknown. A dread settled in, cold and heavy, as the stories from those far-off shores continued to arrive. The stories arrived, yes, but not like clear news reports. They came on the lips of weary sailors, trembling merchants, and frightened pilgrims, each carrying a fragment of horror from cities they'd fled. As these tales journeyed across the vast, indifferent landscape of medieval Europe, they changed. They weren't verified accounts. They were whispers, echoes of screams from across the waves and over the mountains. Each mile the story traveled, it grew, fact mixed freely with frantic guesswork, with the deepest fears about divine punishment or earthly evils. The description of the illness became more grotesque, the speed of death more unbelievable, the sheer scale of the dying more overwhelming. It was like a game of broken telephone played across continents, the original message twisted and amplified by panic and distance. People huddled in dim, smoky taverns or by crackling hearths, straining to hear the latest rumor. The air felt thick with unspoken dread, the kind that catches in your throat and makes you jump at shadows. What exactly was happening? No one knew for sure. They only knew something terrible was coming, carried not just on ships, but on the very breath of these desperate storytellers, painting a picture of an unstoppable doom. Confusion mingled with the cold, creeping terror as these garbled fragments of catastrophe settled upon their villages and towns. And then, those distant whispers weren't so distant anymore. They arrived on weary horses or stumbled in on foot, travelers with eyes wide and clothes ragged from desperate flight. Their faces were gaunt, etched with a profound fear that went deeper than simple weariness. Their voices, hoarse and trembling, didn't just hint at trouble. They spoke of calamity unfolding just days' ride away, bringing the nightmare closer with every fearful word. They told chilling tales of villages left eerily quiet, of houses where no smoke rose from the chimney, of streets where the only sound was the wind whistling through empty doorways. They described a sickness that swelled the body with dark, painful lumps, a swift, brutal end that defied all remedies. You could see the panic in their eyes, almost smell the dust and desperation clinging to their worn cloaks. They didn't just speak of death. They carried its scent, its chilling shadow, directly into your community. The air in the inn, the marketplace, or even the quiet street outside your windows seemed to grow heavy, thick with dread, as their stories spilled out. This wasn't just rumor anymore. This was the chilling, undeniable report from the front lines of an unseen, merciless war. People listened, their own faces growing pale, the initial confusion swiftly replaced by a cold, gnawing fear in the pit of their stomachs. The descriptions became horrifyingly specific, of the speed of the disease, the futility of prayers, the sheer overwhelming scale of the dying. These messengers of doom, exhausted and terrified, brought the pestilence not just in word, but in the palpable dread that settled like a shroud over everything. The stories painted a vivid, terrifying picture that no one in their village could ignore any longer, bringing the inevitable horror to their very doorstep. The terrifying word spread inland, carried by weary travelers in frantic letters, bringing the looming darkness to every village. But before it reached your quiet corner of the world, this dreadful visitor had a different arrival, a maritime entrance. Imagine the bustling ports along the warm Mediterranean shores, or the chillier, gray ports of the north. Here the sea brought not just silks and spices, but something unseen, clinging to ropes and lurking in cargo holds. To the people working on the docks, the arrival of a ship from the east was a common sight, a promise of goods, maybe news from far-off lands. They smelled the salt spray, the tar, the fish, the exotic scents spilling from crates. They heard the gulls cry, the shouts of sailors, the creak of timbers. Life felt normal, grounded in the rhythms of trade and tide. The first whispers of sickness, perhaps on a ship that seemed delayed or docked strangely, felt like a problem for someone else, contained by the wooden hulls and the city walls. It was a distant rumor, a sailor's tale of sickness somewhere far across the water, or maybe just limited to that specific, bustling, sometimes grubby port city. It felt like a problem belonging to those exposed to the constant flow of strangers and goods, not something that could possibly creep its way along the dusty roads, over the hills, and into the quiet fields where you lived. The sea, the ports, they seemed to hold the danger, keeping it separate, a trouble for the coast, not the heartland. It was so easy, in those first days, to believe it would stay there, a problem confined by distance and the endless waves. It seemed so far away, tied to the creak of ships and the cries of gulls. But that feeling, that quiet confidence of distance, began to fray. Slowly at first, like a thread pulled loose on a tapestry, the whispers started. Not just of sickness by the docks anymore, but of fever-gripping villages miles from the salty air. The stories traveled faster than the wind, carried on the breath of travelers, whispered by merchants pulling their carts, murmured over cold hearths at night. And then, the reports stopped being whispers. They became shouts, frantic pleas. You heard of entire hamlets falling silent, of roads choked with carts abandoned halfway, the horses wandering lost in the fields, their harnesses jingling faintly in the sudden quiet. The invisible thing, the one you thought the sea contained, was now on the dusty track outside your door. It didn't need a ship. It walked on the feet of mice, on the backs of fleas, carried in the very air you breathed. It moved inland with unnatural speed, sweeping across the landscape like a dark tide, not of water, but of unseen decay and encroaching dread. It crept into the narrow valleys, flowed over the gentle hills, seeped into the deep, dark forests. Fields lay untended, washing forgotten in the breeze. Nowhere felt truly safe anymore. The comfort of distance, the belief that the coast held the danger, dissolved like mist in the morning sun. It was here, or it was coming, and the only sound left was the frantic beating of your own heart in the sudden, terrifying stillness. And then, the fear wasn't just a whisper on the wind or a distant rumor. It had a face, a terrifying, visible face. It started small, perhaps in the poorest corner of the village, or a cramped room above the tailor's shop in the town. Someone felt a strange, aching tenderness in their groin or armpit, a little knot under the skin. Within hours, or maybe a day, that knot became a swelling. Hot to the touch, incredibly painful, growing larger and darker, sometimes to the size of an egg. The skin over it stretched taut and shiny, often turning a bruised, angry purple or black. These were the buboes, the terrible heralds of the Black Death, appearing right there, on familiar bodies among neighbors and friends. Whispers flew, hushed and frantic. "Have you seen Thomas? He has the..." People didn't even want to name it. The silence that followed the mention of symptoms was heavy with dread. Doors that were once open were suddenly closed, curtains drawn tight. Suspicion flickered in the eyes of those who felt fine, towards those who looked different. Every cough, every ache, every moment of feeling slightly warm brought a fresh wave of terror. The comforting rhythm of daily life shattered instantly. The sight of those dark swellings meant the unstoppable tide had finally reached their doorstep, bringing not just sickness, but a profound, chilling certainty of impending loss and agonizing fear into every home. Okay, the silence gave way to the terrible reality. The sickness wasn't just fear. It had a physical form, horrifyingly vivid, and unlike anything anyone had ever witnessed. First, there was often a sudden fever, burning hot, sometimes with chills that shook the body uncontrollably. Then came the vomiting, often blood, and intense, unbearable pain throughout the body. But the most terrifying sign, the one that truly marked this illness as a monstrous anomaly, was the swellings. These weren't just simple lumps. They were dark, angry nodes, often the size of eggs or even apples, appearing most commonly in the armpits, groin, or neck. The skin over them would turn a bruised, purplish-black color, hence the name Black Death. They pulsed with pain, and the sheer visible horror of them told everyone who saw them that this was no ordinary fever or flux. It was something alien, something fundamentally wrong. Medieval doctors, armed with their knowledge of humors and herbs, were utterly bewildered. Phlebotomy, applying leeches, poultices of roots and dung. Their usual tools were laughably, tragically useless against this relentless assault. They poked, they prodded, they prescribed prayers and potions, but nothing, absolutely nothing, slowed the terrifying march of the symptoms. The body simply broke down, often in just a few agonizing days, leaving behind a profound sense of helplessness and a world grappling with a disease that defied all understanding. The living could only watch, bewildered and terrified, as the swelling spread and the darkness took hold. The terror of watching the dying quickly curdled into a cold, gripping dread that seeped into the very fabric of daily life. Where there had been the familiar sounds of blacksmiths hammering, farmers calling, children playing, a terrible quiet began to settle. The comforting, predictable rhythm of village or city life simply broke. People stopped visiting neighbors. Doors stayed shut, bolted from the inside. Windows shuttered tight against the unseen enemy thought to float on the air. Suspicion bloomed, sharp and bitter. Did that person cough? Were they standing too close? The simple act of passing someone in the street could send a jolt of fear through you, a primal urge to turn and flee. Marketplaces, usually the loud, chaotic heart of a community, fell silent, stalls abandoned, food left to rot. Churches, meant to offer solace, became places of desperate, terrified prayer, or lay eerily empty as priests succumbed. The rituals and routines that had anchored life for centuries offered no comfort now, only a stark reminder of how utterly vulnerable everyone had become. Fear wasn't just an occasional visitor, it was the new atmosphere, thick and suffocating. Even the air felt heavy with it. That heavy fear hung everywhere, thick and suffocating. But what made it truly unbearable was the profound, terrifying lack of understanding. No one knew why this was happening. They didn't know about tiny fleas biting rats, carrying unseen invaders. They didn't know about the silent, relentless spread through the air, person to person. Instead, people desperately grasped at explanations that offered no real comfort or solution. Whispers turned into pronouncements. It was God's wrath, a terrible punishment for humanity's sins. Perhaps the alignment of the stars was wrong, or maybe it was a poisonous vapor, a foul miasma rising from the earth itself, tainting the very air you breathed. Imagine trying to fight an enemy you couldn't see, whose origins were a complete mystery, attributed only to divine fury or unseen astrological forces. This ignorance meant every action felt random, every precaution useless. Barricading doors, burning fragrant herbs to purify the air, carrying posies of flowers. These were acts of desperate hope against an invisible, unstoppable force. You saw people healthy in the morning, covered in dark swellings by nightfall. Someone coughed near you, someone touched a door handle, and the chilling question lingered. Had it already claimed them? Was it now claiming you? The smell of death was one thing, yes. But the air felt thickest with the smell of unanswered questions, of sheer, helpless confusion. It was like living blindfolded in a minefield. Okay, building from that. The terror wasn't just about asterisk your potential fate. Oh no. That was just the opening act, in a theater of quiet horrors. It was watching everyone around you succumb. The wife, the husband, the child, the parent, the neighbor who borrowed your shovel last week. One moment, they were just them, complaining about the price of bread or fixing a roof tile. The next, they were shivering, their eyes distant, a terrible certainty settling over you like a shroud. You sat by their bedside, or perhaps just a corner of a straw mattress, your hands useless. You watched the fever climb, felt their skin grow impossibly hot, then chillingly cold. You saw the dark splotches bloom on their skin, like macabre flowers pushing up from beneath. There was nothing to do. No medicine that worked, no prayer that seemed to be heard. Just waiting. Waiting, and watching them fade, the breath growing shallower, the groans softening into silence. The silence afterwards was perhaps the loudest thing of all, an empty space where laughter or simple breathing used to be. The physical presence remained for a time, a body that was no longer the person you knew, but a vessel for the plague's grim art. And then the task of disposal, adding another layer of awful, necessary work to the unbearable grief. Being a survivor often meant being the one left to handle the dead. It was a heavy mantle, draped in sorrow and the ever-present fear that you were next. After the silence settled, heavy and final, from those who didn't make it, a new kind of noise began. It wasn't a sound you could hear with your ears, but a persistent hum of fear that vibrated in your bones. You had done what you could, buried the dead, cleaned where cleaning felt futile, and now you were left with the living. But who among you would still be counted among the living tomorrow? This was the insidious torment of the survivor. You looked at your remaining friends, your family, the few neighbors left on the street. You saw their faces, gaunt and tired, perhaps lined with fresh grief. And you wondered, was that flush on their cheek just exhaustion, or the first cruel kiss of the pestilence? Was that slight shiver a chill from the damp air, or the internal tremors that preceded the swellings? Every shared meal, every brief, cautious conversation felt like a gamble. You tried not to think about it, to focus on the endless, grim chores that remained. But the thought was always there, lurking just beneath the surface of your awareness, a cold, hard stone in your gut. Anyone could be next. Anyone you cared about could suddenly develop the telltale signs. The fever, the headache, the dark buboes appearing like foul fruit under the skin. You watched, you worried, and you waited, trapped in a waking nightmare of uncertainty that felt heavier, perhaps, than even the sorrow for those already gone. And so, with that cold stone lodged in your gut, the sheer, overwhelming terror of it all would eventually become too much for some. You couldn't bear to sit and wait, watching the signs appear on neighbors, on friends, perhaps even on your own family. The thought of just getting away, putting miles between yourself and this invisible killer, became a desperate driving urge. So you might have packed a few things. Whatever food you could spare. A warm cloak, maybe a small, worn coin, and slipped out of your silent, watchful town under the cover of dawn or dusk. The streets would feel unnervingly empty. The only sounds, perhaps the creak of a loose shutter, or the distant mournful tolling of a bell. You'd walk, perhaps with others equally desperate, heading for the open fields, the dense woods, the hope that somehow the pure country air would offer protection. But the reality of the countryside was often harsh and unforgiving. Isolated hamlets might turn you away, fearful that you carried the very sickness they were praying to avoid. You might find yourself sleeping under the stars, shivering against the damp earth, with the sounds of the unfamiliar night pressing in. Food would dwindle quickly, and the quiet fear would still be there, a constant companion on your lonely, uncertain journey. It wasn't the peaceful escape you dreamed of. It was just a different kind of struggle, equally isolating, and perhaps even more vulnerable. Yes, others feared you carried the sickness, but the truly grim truth was, you very well might have been. The Black Death wasn't always a sudden, dramatic collapse that struck down strangers. It could be a quiet, insidious thing at first, hiding within a person even before the telltale buboes rose, or the fever gripped tight. You might feel just a little tired, a slight ache perhaps, easily dismissed as the weariness of travel or the poor food you'd managed to scavenge. But the Yersinia pestis bacteria, or whatever the unknown agent was that brought such horror, could already be hitching a ride. It traveled with you, unseen and unfelt initially, in your breath, on your clothes, or simply lurking within your own body as it silently multiplied. It was a cruel, invisible companion on that desperate journey, a shadow you couldn't outrun, no matter how far you walked or how isolated a place you found. Imagine that low hum of anxiety that settled deep in your gut. Were you just tired? Or was that the first whisper of the sickness? Every slight shiver, every moment of fatigue, could send a jolt of icy fear through you. You were trying desperately to escape death. Yet death might have already nested within you, waiting. And worse, you could be unknowingly carrying it to others, to those who perhaps offered you a crumb of kindness or a place near their meager fire, sealing their fate as well. This wasn't just surviving the initial terrifying wave, it was navigating a world where the very air felt tainted, and you yourself might be the invisible carrier of doom. The immense relief of surviving was constantly undercut by the terrifying uncertainty of whether you were truly free, or just on a longer, slower path towards becoming another statistic. It added a deep, suffocating layer of dread to an already desperate existence. And then, there was the quiet. After the initial wave of terror and the dreadful sounds of suffering faded, what was left was a silence that felt heavier than any noise. Villages that had once echoed with the rhythms of daily life, the clang of the blacksmith, the lowing of cattle, the distant laughter of children, the creak of a mill wheel turning, were now unnervingly still. Imagine walking down a lane where only weeks before neighbors had called greetings across fences and hearing nothing. Just your own footsteps crunching on the path, maybe the whisper of wind through empty doorways. The world outside your small bubble of survival had simply stopped making noise. Fires were out in hearths. Livestock wandered listlessly or lay dead in fields, uncollected. The air itself seemed to hang heavy and mournful. This wasn't just the absence of sound. It was the presence of absence. Every silent window, every door hanging open to an empty house, every untended field spoke volumes about the lives that were no longer there. It was a constant, passive reminder of the scale of the loss. A blanket of quiet despair that settled over the land and its few remaining inhabitants. The sounds of life had been replaced by the echoing vacuum of death. Okay, so the quiet was profound, almost a physical weight pressing down on the few who remained. But it wasn't just the absence of sound that marked this new, bleak world. There was another sense that couldn't escape the plague's terrible touch. A sense that was constantly assaulted, hour after hour, day after day. It was the smell. Imagine, if you can, the air itself feeling thick, not just with stillness, but with a sweet, cloying, utterly sickening odor. This wasn't the smell of cooking fires or clean rain, or even just the usual village muck. No, this was something far worse, something that spoke only of decay and rot. Bodies had been left where they fell, in homes, in fields, sometimes even in the streets or shallow, overflowing pits. Animals lay dead in barns and fields, bloating under the sun. There was often no one left with the strength or the will to bury them properly, or collect the waste that piled up unchecked. The air wasn't just carrying the scent, it seemed saturated with it. It clung to your clothes, your hair, the rough wood of your house. It seeped into everything, a constant, nauseating reminder of the devastation that had swept through. Every breath you took pulled this grim reality deep into your lungs. You couldn't open a window for fresh air, because the fresh air outside was just more of the same pervasive, sickening perfume of death. And the source of that sickening perfume, well, it was all around you. The quiet streets that had once bustled with life now held only a terrible stillness, broken only by the wind whispering through abandoned doorways. And the bodies. They were everywhere, struck down in their homes, slumped against fences, even lying in the very fields they had hoped to harvest. With most of the living either dead themselves or far too weak and terrified to help, the essential ancient task of burying the dead became an impossible burden. There simply weren't enough hands strong enough to lift the lifeless weight, not enough healthy souls left with the heart for such grim work. The rituals, the quiet dignity usually afforded to the departed, they vanished like smoke in the wind. Instead, if anything was done at all, immense pits were dug outside the town or village limits. Hasty, deep trenches scarred the earth, waiting to receive their terrible harvest. You might see carts creaking slowly by, piled high with bodies, a silent procession of unimaginable sorrow. Or perhaps you were one of the few, forcing your aching muscles to the task, the soft earth giving way under your shovel, the sheer number of those lost pressing down on you. There was no comfort in these hurried burials, only the stark, brutal reality of overwhelming death. The ground swallowed them up, but the memory, the presence of the lost lingered everywhere, heavy on the air, a constant visual reminder of the world that had just ended. This wasn't just death. It was the raw, undignified collapse of life itself, played out in plain sight. You were among those few, maybe, whose legs still held them, whose lungs still pulled air. Not the clean air you remember, but air thick and cloying with the scent of the recently departed. The work was unending. Not just the digging, though there was so much digging, earth yielding under tired shovels again and again. It was the carrying, the lifting of limbs that offered no resistance, the arrangement of bodies in layers like cordwood, because there simply wasn't enough space or time for anything else. Your muscles screamed, but a strange numbness settled over your mind. The air tasted foul, a bitter tang that coated your tongue. You didn't just smell death, you felt it, a heavy blanket draped over everything. Maybe you were a priest, trying to murmur hurried rites over dozens at once, the sacred words feeling hollow against the stark industrial scale of the dying. Or just a neighbor, pressed into service because there was no one else. Hands calloused and raw, back perpetually bent. Sleep offered little escape. The images lingered. The faces, contorted or strangely peaceful in rigor mortis, were seared behind your eyelids. The sound of your own breathing felt too loud in the unnerving quiet of a village, where the usual sounds of life had simply stopped. There was no heroism in this work, only the grim, necessary act of disposing of the overwhelming evidence of sorrow day after day, until you felt less like a person and more like an extension of the shovel, burying the world one grave at a time. But soon, even that grim, solitary work of burying one body after another became impossible. The dead mounted faster than hands could dig single graves. The sheer scale of the dying demanded a new, horrifying efficiency. So the earth was disturbed not in small, neat plots, but in vast, yawning trenches. Imagine the sight. Acres of land, often just outside the town walls or in fields, torn open. Not sacred ground anymore, just ground. The soil, freshly turned, darker and richer than the surface, lay in mounds beside long, rectangular pits. These weren't graves. They were communal ditches, hastily dug, waiting. The smell here was different too, not just the sickly sweet scent of decay that pervaded the village, but a heavier, more concentrated aroma, rising from the disturbed earth itself, a smell that promised only oblivion beneath. The air felt thick with it, even the wind seemed to carry the weight of so much death. Seeing these mass graves stretching out, row after row, was to see the population depletion made starkly, sickeningly visible. It was the ultimate landscape of loss. A chilling, permanent scar upon the land, a silent testament to how completely life had unraveled. This wasn't just burying the dead. It was burying a world, layer upon layer, in a desperate, unending act. And as the frantic digging finally slowed, replaced by an eerie, unsettling silence, you might find yourself standing there, heart still beating, air still entering your lungs, and feel nothing like relief. The air, once thick with dread and the stench of death, now felt thin, empty, like the silence pressing in on you. It was a silence where the familiar sounds of life, a blacksmith's hammer, children playing, the distant lowing of cattle, were simply gone, replaced by an almost unbearable quiet that hummed with absence. Looking around, the faces of the few others who remained weren't those of victors, but of ghosts haunting a landscape that no longer made sense. There was a strange, hollow look in their eyes, mirroring the emptiness stretching out across the fields and through the rows of silent houses. You were alive, yes, but surrounded by absence, by the profound quiet left by so many missing voices. Why had you been spared? Why had the sickness taken your family, your friends, the vibrant heart of the community, but somehow missed you? This wasn't a triumph. It felt more like a mistake, a glitch in the grim mechanics of the plague, leaving you stranded. Every empty chair at the sparse communal table, every silent home with its door ajar, every unplowed field stretching endlessly was a physical, aching reminder of the lives lost. The village, your home, felt like a stage where the actors had vanished mid-performance, leaving only a handful of bewildered onlookers in the eerie quiet. And the weight of what came next. The sheer, impossible task of just existing, let alone rebuilding with so few hands, settled upon you, heavy and cold. Survival wasn't a reward. It was a burden in a world utterly, irrevocably changed, leaving you one of the few left to witness the silence. And then, eventually for a lucky few, the fever would break. The world might slowly, hazily drift back into focus. You'd wake, drenched in sweat, body aching, throat raw, but alive. The rough straw of your mattress might scratch your skin, the smell of sickness still thick in the air around you, but you could breathe again, weakly. The silence outside your door was the first real clue that something was profoundly wrong. Not the usual quiet of night, but a heavy, unnatural stillness that pressed in. No distant hammering, no children's cries, no neighbors' faint singing. Just an absence, vast and echoing. When you finally found the strength to pull yourself up, perhaps stumbling to a window, the sight confirmed the dread. The village, usually bustling with whatever life the day held, was deserted. Doors stood open, belongings lay scattered, and there were simply no people. only the wind whistling through empty lanes, carrying the scent of decay. This wasn't recovery, it was emerging into a graveyard wearing the disguise of your home. The sheer crushing emptiness of it all was almost harder to bear than the sickness itself. You had survived, only to find yourself a ghost in a world of ghosts. You had survived, only to find yourself a ghost in a world of ghosts. But merely surviving the initial storm of the Black Death was far from a swift return to vitality. Your body, ravaged by days and nights of fever and illness, remained a profoundly fragile, aching vessel. Every breath felt shallow, stolen, rather than taken freely from the still air. Lifting your head from the thin, scratchy blanket piled with whatever meager cloth you could find was an act of sheer, exhausting will. Even the simple task of sitting up or standing could make the world spin sickeningly around you. This wasn't just tiredness. It was a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that clung to you like damp, heavy cloth, weighing down every single limb. Muscles you hadn't known existed pulsed with a dull, constant ache that no amount of rest seemed capable of easing. The very taste in your mouth was often one of lingering sickness, a metallic, bitter reminder of the battle your body had just fought. Even the sound of your own breathing seemed labored, a gentle, yet strangely loud, rasping sound in the overwhelming silence of the empty house. Weeks often turned into months, and still, the weakness persisted, a constant, unwelcome companion shadowing your every movement. You weren't simply recovering. You were learning to exist within a body that felt fundamentally broken, a living testament to the terrifying closeness of death you had only just escaped. The energy required to search for scraps of food, to mend a tattered garment against the chill, or even just to walk hesitantly down the empty lane felt like a distant, almost unattainable luxury. This persistent, lingering sickness was a cruel, drawn-out twist after the terrifying immediate battle for life itself, a quiet suffering after the loud one. But maybe, just maybe, harder than the bone-deep ache and the lingering cough, was the quiet horror that settled in the spaces the plague had cleared out. The silence was deafening. You walked down streets where laughter and shouting and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer used to echo, and now there was only an unnerving stillness, broken perhaps by a lone dog scavenging or the creak of an abandoned sign in the wind. Every familiar doorway you passed felt like a punch to the gut, a stark reminder of the faces that no longer greeted you, the voices that were permanently hushed. Your home, once a crowded, noisy haven, now felt vast and cold, filled with the ghosts of touch and sound that would never return. The air itself seemed heavy with unspoken grief, a collective sorrow that seeped into your bones and settled like a lead blanket. Surviving didn't feel like winning. It often felt like being left behind in a world you no longer recognized, peopled by strangers or fellow survivors too shell-shocked to connect. There was the weight of loss, yes, an ocean of it, but also perhaps a whisper of guilt. Why you and not them? This profound loneliness, this eerie quiet after the storm, was a scar etched not on the body but deep within the soul of the survivor. Stepping outside after weeks, maybe months, huddled away from the unseen terror felt like entering a different dimension. The door creaked open, a surprisingly loud sound in the stillness. You stood on the threshold, blinking, your eyes adjusting to the light. But it was the asterisk lack of sensation that hit you first, a profound, unsettling quiet. The village square stretched before you, unnaturally wide, unnaturally still. Gone were the usual jostling crowds, the colorful cloths of the market stalls, the low murmur of bartering, the rhythmic clang from the blacksmith's forge down the lane. The air didn't carry the mingled smells of baking bread, livestock, and wood smoke. Instead, it felt thin, almost sterile, carrying only the faint, sad scent of damp earth and perhaps something heavier, harder to place. Where were the children chasing geese, their laughter echoing off the wattle and daub walls, the old women sharing gossip on the steps, the farmer bringing in his cart, his horse snorting steam into the crisp air? Just nothing. Cobblestones laid bare, swept clean not by brooms but by the sheer, overwhelming absence of life. A single worn wooden cart sat abandoned by the well, a silent monument to its missing owner and the life that had stopped. The houses surrounding the square stared back with dark, vacant window eyes, like empty sockets in a skull. The silence was profound, heavy, vibrating not with peace, but with the echoing memory of noise. Every gust of wind sighing through the empty space seemed to whisper names you knew, names now added to the long, long list, carved onto grief-stricken hearts. Stepping into that quiet square wasn't freedom. It was stepping into the world the plague had left behind, a lonely, hollow stage waiting for a play that would never be performed again. You stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over you, heavy and absolute. But the quiet wasn't what you needed. You needed a familiar face, a warm voice calling your name, the solid comfort of someone else who had somehow made it through this nightmare alongside you. So, you began to walk. Your footsteps echoed unnervingly on the cobblestones, the only sound breaking the vast, unnatural stillness of the street. You passed doors you knew well, doors that had always opened with laughter or shouted greetings. Now, they remained resolutely shut, or sometimes swung slightly ajar in the wind, revealing only more darkness and quiet inside. The air, usually thick with the smell of wood smoke and cooking and damp earth, now held only the faint, unsettling scent of nothing, just empty air. You reached the lane where your friend Alara lived, the house with the bright blue shutters she was so proud of. Hesitantly, you pushed the gate. It groaned softly, protesting the movement in the profound quiet. You walked up to the door, raising a tentative hand to knock. But the knock never came. You simply pushed the door inward. It swung open with a slow creak, revealing the small, familiar room inside. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of light, slanting from the window. A half-finished loaf of bread sat on the table, hard as stone now. A cloak lay folded neatly on a chair. Everything was exactly as it had been left, preserved in this sudden, terrible stillness. There was no one here, only the quiet and the ghost of a life that had simply stopped. You felt a cold, heavy ache settle deep in your chest. This was not survival. This was solitude. The stillness in that room, the profound absence. It wasn't unique to your doorstep. Step outside, into the muted light of day. The quiet wasn't just in the houses. It hung heavy in the very air, like a damp shroud. The marketplace felt strangely vast, half empty of the familiar bustling crowds and lively shouts. The fields had fewer hands to work them, the rhythm of daily life broken. Every street corner held a ghost. The baker who made your bread, the carpenter who fixed your roof, the neighbor who shared a joke over the fence, the children who used to play hopscotch on the cobblestones. They were all gone, swallowed by the sickness, leaving behind only echo and emptiness. And the sheer number of them. It was impossible to truly grasp, a scale of death that defied understanding. So many names, so many faces, so many individual lives suddenly snuffed out. Your family, your friends, people you'd known your entire life, their laughter and voices now just silent memories. Trying to count the loss felt like trying to count the stars on a moonless night. Overwhelming, impossible, and ultimately just a quiet, persistent ache in your chest. This wasn't just individual sadness, tucked away in private corners. It was a collective wound, a deep, gaping tear in the very fabric of your world. Every survivor carried it, a shared, unspoken grief that settled over the land. You'd look into the eyes of others who remained, and see your own sorrow reflected there, mixed with a desperate, fragile fear of what remained. The quiet ache settled deep in your bones, a constant, physical reminder of the unimaginable cost. Life went on, yes, slowly, hesitantly, the survivors picking up the pieces, but beneath the surface of everyday tasks, the crushing weight of all that lost life remained, a silent, heavy burden you carried with you every single day. And as you would step outside, into the thin, cool air of what remained of your village, the silence was perhaps the most striking thing. Not just the usual country quiet, but a deep, profound stillness that settled over everything. Houses stood like hollowed-out shells, rows of vacant eyes staring out. Many doors weren't even properly latched anymore. They simply hung open a little, creaking softly on their ancient hinges with every passing breath of wind. If you ever found the courage to look inside, dust motes would dance like tiny, sad spirits in the shafts of light, filtering through grimy, cobwebbed windows. A forgotten wooden bowl might still sit on a simple table, holding the dry remnants of a last uneaten meal. A spinning wheel stood idle, the wool still attached, a task left forever unfinished. These were small, poignant relics, frozen moments of lives abruptly cut short. The air inside these vacant homes was heavy, stale, carrying the faint, sad scent of long disuse, mingling with a lingering echo of the fear that must have filled those final moments. No welcoming plume of smoke rose from the cold stone chimneys. No warm light spilled from the windows at dusk. No sound of footsteps on the floorboards. No quiet murmur of conversation. No children's hurried shouts echoing down the empty lane. Just the ceaseless whisper of the wind through the eaves, and the profound, heavy knowledge that behind these silent walls, entire families, whole generations sometimes, had simply vanished. It wasn't merely that the buildings were empty. It was that the very air felt saturated with the quiet, invisible presence of the hundreds, perhaps thousands of ghosts who had once called this place home. And if you were one of the survivors, one of the few left standing in that sudden, terrible quiet, there was the unavoidable task of the homes themselves. Entering a house where everyone had succumbed was never easy. The air would hang heavy and still, often smelling faintly of sickness, or just stale emptiness mixed with the persistent, unsettling odor of decay that lingered despite attempts at airing. Dust motes danced in the sparse light that managed to penetrate the grimy window panes, illuminating the profound stillness within. Everything was left exactly as it was. A bowl on the table, a tool by the hearth, clothes folded, or perhaps discarded in haste. These weren't grand treasures. They were the simple, worn objects of daily life. A wooden spoon, a patched cloak, a pair of well-used shoes kicked off by the door. Handling these items felt strange, almost intrusive. These were things intimately connected to people who were here just days ago, living, breathing, worrying about tomorrow. Now, only their things remained, silent witnesses to their final moments. It was a somber inventory. Clothes that might still carry a risk were often bundled and burned, the smoke adding another acrid layer to the burdened air. Furniture might be salvaged, tools cleaned and claimed by the living, who were desperately short-handed now. But mostly, it was just the quiet, awkward process of gathering up the remnants of lives, deciding what to do with a lifetime's worth of small, personal effects that suddenly had no owner. Each object was a tiny, mute echo in the overwhelming silence, a small, tangible reminder of the void left behind. The silence wasn't confined to the empty cottages and hushed streets. It stretched out far beyond the village limits, spilling across the landscape like an invisible shroud. Out into the fields, the places that should have been alive with sound and movement. Picture it. Wide swaths of land, ready for planting, or perhaps already showing the first tender green shoots, but utterly deserted. Where was the familiar rhythm? The steady, grounding, thump-thump of hoes turning the earth? The distant, sometimes off-key, singing of field hands trying to make the long hours pass? The shouted greetings? The casual chatter? The scolding crows startled by human presence? All gone. Replaced by an immense, unnatural stillness that felt heavier than any noise could be. The crops themselves might still be growing, swaying gently in the breeze like silent witnesses. But no hands reached out to tend them. No fingers pulled the persistent weeds that were now free to creep and flourish, untroubled. The rich smell of damp earth was still in the air after a rain, perhaps, but it lacked the sharp human tang of sweat and relentless effort that should have accompanied it. This wasn't just quiet. It was a deafening absence. A gaping, palpable hole, where thousands of people had once spent their days, their lives, bent over the soil from sunup to sundown. It meant the crucial harvest, the very source of life for the coming year, was now uncertain, perhaps impossible. The silence in the fields wasn't peaceful. It was a chilling prophecy of famine and hardship, a constant, visual echo of the impossible loss and the overwhelming, terrifying task that faced the few who remained. The quiet in the fields wasn't just an absence of human sound. It was a physical manifestation of disaster unfolding slowly, relentlessly. The wheat, the vital grain that should have been nearing harvest, stood forgotten, its golden heads now brittle and drooping, their promise withering under the uncaring sun. Weeds, opportunistic and vigorous, surged through the furrows, a tangled, suffocating green claiming dominion over the valuable crops. You might walk amongst them, feeling the dry, papery husks crunch underfoot, perhaps catching the faint, sad scent of dying plants mingling with the warm earth. Beyond the fields, the very lifeblood of the village was also adrift. Livestock, meant to be guided, milked, and protected, now wandered with mournful lowing or silent, desperate hunger. Cows stood by empty troughs, their udders heavy and aching, or shuffled listlessly across overgrown pastures. Sheep, their wool heavy and matted from months unshorn, huddled together, vulnerable and lost. The rhythmic sounds of animal husbandry, the clatter of buckets, the calls of the herdsmen, were gone, replaced by a profound stillness, broken only by the occasional forlorn bleating or the quiet rustle of an animal pushing through untamed brambles. Imagine the sight, stretching across the landscape, not just a single neglected patch, but vast tracts of land returning to the wild, teeming with lost life and dying food. This wasn't a minor setback. It was the fundamental collapse of their agrarian world. Every withered stalk, every lost animal was a quiet, constant reminder that surviving the plague was only the beginning of an impossible struggle against hunger and the chilling reality of a world utterly transformed. And with the people gone, something else vital withered away, something perhaps even more fundamental than the crops. The intricate web of community, the threads of mutual obligation that had bound these villages together for centuries, simply snapped. It wasn't just that fewer hands were available for the harvest. It was that fewer hearts were there to share the burden, fewer voices to offer comfort. Imagine the silence where laughter and shared stories once echoed on the village green, the barn raising that never happened because too many key people were gone, the sick neighbor who lay alone because the network of carers had vanished. Medieval life depended on this delicate social safety net, where everyone had a place, a duty, a connection to others. It was a system built on knowing your neighbor, on shared history and mutual aid. When so many disappeared so quickly, that safety net didn't just fray, it disintegrated entirely. Surviving the plague often meant surviving into profound, chilling isolation. You might have food, if you were lucky, but who would help you mend your fence, or watch your children while you worked the fields, or simply sit with you through the long, quiet evenings? The vibrant, noisy, messy heart of the community had been ripped out, leaving a hollow echo in its place. What remained was a lonely, fragmented existence for those left behind. The vibrant, noisy, messy heart of the community had been ripped out, leaving a hollow echo in its place. What remained was a lonely, fragmented existence for those left behind. But the problems didn't stop at your immediate neighbors, the folks you shared bread with or borrowed a tool from. Think about the people who ran things, the ones who provided order, however arbitrary or harsh it might have felt sometimes. Your local reeve, the villager appointed to manage the lord's affairs and collect dues? Likely among the first to go, often living closely and dealing with everyone. The lord's bailiff, who managed the manor lands and court. Perhaps they fell ill too, collapsing in their small office, quill pen dropping onto the dusty parchment. Even the lord or lady themselves, residing in their stone manor house or timber hall, weren't immune. The Black Death didn't respect titles or privilege. It crept past thick walls and heavy doors just as easily as it seeped into thatched cottages. So, you might be standing amidst the ruins of your village's social fabric, and you look up the track towards where the authority used to reside. What greets you? Often silence. An empty manor house, perhaps. Its windows dark and unseeing, like vacant eyes. No one to tell you what to do, yes, which might sound appealing at first. But quickly, the reality bites. No one to organize the spring planting of the common fields. No one to ensure the vital watermill still ground the grain, its great wooden wheel creaking a lonely tune. No one to maintain the bridges or mend the cart tracks, however poor they were already. The structure, the often resented framework of daily life, had simply evaporated like morning mist. Suddenly, the most basic rules felt unclear. Was rent still owed? To whom, when everyone was gone? Who would witness a sale, or settle a dispute over land? This wasn't freedom. It was a deep, unsettling void, where leadership and basic organization used to be, adding another heavy layer to the quiet struggle of survival. The silence wasn't just about the missing people. It was about the living too, and the heavy quiet that fell between them. When you saw a neighbor walking down the empty lane, your steps might instinctively slow. Your eyes met theirs for a fleeting, uncomfortable moment, then quickly, almost guiltily, darted away, searching the ground or the empty doorway instead. The familiar paths between cottages, once worn smooth by frequent visits and casual chats, suddenly felt vast and empty. A simple walk across the green became a tense, cautious journey, filled with unseen boundaries. Was that cough just dust stirred by a nervous footstep, or the first, terrible sign returning? Could they still carry it, hidden inside their seemingly healthy bodies, a silent threat walking towards you? The fear wasn't just for your own fragile life, hanging by a thread, but for what they might still bring, unintentionally or perhaps terrifyingly otherwise. The very air between people felt thick with unspoken anxieties and the ghost of contagion. And beneath the immediate terror of the disease itself, a cold, dark suspicion began to bloom in the surviving hearts. Why had they survived, when others, perhaps seemingly more pious or kind, had not? Whispers, softer than the wind through the ruined roof, spoke of divine judgment, of hidden sins finally exposed, or even darker, unspoken arts that had somehow granted immunity. That lingering question, why them and not me, became a silent, insidious wedge, breeding resentment and fear. The bonds of shared hardship, usually strong in a small community, frayed and snapped under this pressure. Trust, once the invisible glue that held everything together, dissolved into cautious suspicion, leaving each person feeling terribly alone. The very air in the village, even after the worst smells had faded, carried a new, palpable tension. Every step outside your door felt like wading through a silent, invisible fog of mistrust. Neighborly smiles, once freely given like a warm cup of ale, were now tight, guarded expressions. You'd meet someone's eyes across the rutted path, and instead of recognition, you'd see calculation. Were you judged for surviving? Were they envying your continued breath while their own kin were gone? Simple transactions became fraught with unspoken questions. Handing over coins for a bolt of cloth or a basket of eggs. Was this vendor truly honest, or did their continued prosperity hint at something darker? Did your own possessions seem too plentiful in this new world of scarcity, marking you as unfairly lucky or even somehow complicit in others' misfortune? Each exchange was a tightrope walk over a ravine of potential accusation or resentment. Walking past a home you'd visited countless times before felt alien. The shared history, the easy banter, the communal comfort of simply knowing everyone, it had all dissolved. Now you might receive a curt nod, an awkward silence, or sometimes just a chilling blank stare that spoke volumes about the distance that had opened up between people. The glue that held the village together, that simple faith in each other, had utterly failed, leaving you to navigate this changed world feeling profoundly alone, even surrounded by faces you once considered family. That feeling of profound isolation, the unraveling of familiar faces and shared history, extended beyond personal relationships. It began to fray the very fabric of order, the quiet agreements and unspoken rules that had held society together. When so many people simply vanished, the lord, the bailiff, the priest, the neighbors you'd always relied on to witness a dispute or simply keep an eye out, a strange, unsettling vacuum opened up. The manor house might stand silent, its gates unbarred, no longer the stern symbol of justice or authority. The pathways between villages once busy with traders and travelers felt longer, quieter, and more exposed. You'd find yourself listening intently to the wind in the trees, or scanning the horizon with an anxious gaze, for the sense of safety that authority provides, however flawed, had largely evaporated with the people who embodied it. Disputes over land, inheritance, or even stolen chickens might now be settled not by the village elder or the lordsman, but by whoever happened to be strongest or most desperate, or simply furthest from the surviving vestiges of law. Opportunism slithered into the quiet spaces left by death. Things that were once unthinkable, blatant theft, squatting on abandoned properties, or ignoring ancient customary rights, became worryingly common. The world felt less predictable, less fair, and certainly less secure than it had before. You survived the plague itself, yes, but navigating this new, unbound reality brought its own distinct and unnerving set of anxieties, a quiet hum of vulnerability beneath the surface of everyday life. And among those shifting anxieties, the most primal often gnawed at your stomach: hunger. The fields that once shimmered green or golden under the sun now often lay fallow, quiet, and overgrown. So many hands that had tilled the soil, sown the seeds, and brought in the harvest were simply gone. Villages were depleted, not just of people, but of the essential rhythm of farming life. Who would plow? Who would weed? Who would gather the grain when the time came? And even if food was grown nearby, the complex threads of trade that had once moved grain from fertile plains to hungry towns, or vegetables from market gardens to city kitchens, were frayed, sometimes snapped entirely. Roads were emptier, riskier. Local markets, once bustling hubs of exchange smelling of sweat, earth, and baking bread, might now be quiet, stocked with little but desperation. Your small, meager patch might yield something, perhaps a few scraggly turnips or a handful of beans, but the abundance you'd maybe once taken for granted was a distant memory. Forget the smell of roasting meat or fresh-baked loaves filling the air. The dominant scent was often damp earth, and the lingering, stale aroma of whatever thin gruel you managed to boil over a hesitant fire. Simply finding enough calories to make it through the day became a quiet, exhausting struggle. The quiet hung heavy in the air, a constant reminder of those who were gone. Fields stood untended, shops were shuttered tight, and the familiar bustle of village life was reduced to a whisper. As you walked, perhaps searching for a forgotten patch of herbs or a dropped apple, your eyes would inevitably settle on the empty doorways, the silent windows staring out like vacant eyes. These were the homes of your neighbors, your friends, your family, now left open to the wind and the rain. Stepping inside one was a strange, chilling experience. The air was thick, with the scent of dust and stillness, perhaps the faint, lingering smell of sickness, or just the profound quiet of disuse. Possessions lay scattered as if the occupants had just stepped out for a moment. A half-finished meal on the table, tools leaning against a wall, a child's toy dropped on the floor. Everything held the ghost of a life that was abruptly extinguished, frozen in time by the invisible hand of death. There was potential here, certainly. Shelter from the elements, maybe some dry firewood, even abandoned pots or blankets that might prove useful. But taking anything felt complicated. You were picking through the remnants of the dead, wearing their clothes, sleeping in their beds. Each object was a quiet, mournful testament to someone who didn't make it. It was a grim inheritance, paid for with unimaginable sorrow, and the eerie silence that now blanketed the land. Even the riches of the abandoned felt heavy, weighted with loss. Yes, these remnants of lives were heavy, but stepping outside, the silence spoke of something even larger. The emptiness wasn't just in the homes. It stretched out across the fields, the pastures, the very landscape itself. Paths once trod by dozens of busy feet were now silent, beginning to blur as weeds crept in. The air, though perhaps less burdened by the immediate smell of death than weeks ago, still felt hollow, vast. Imagine standing on a gentle rise looking out, miles and miles of fertile soil, fields that had fed families for generations, lay fallow. There were barns standing empty, stone walls outlining pastures where no sheep or cattle now grazed. It looked, at first glance, like an incredible opportunity. All this land, now available, seemingly waiting to be claimed. But this was a cruel mirage. Land, no matter how rich, means little without the hands to work it. The survivors were few, scattered, often weakened by illness or grief. One family couldn't possibly farm a manor's worth of land. A lone farmer couldn't tend fields meant for a whole village. The sheer scale of the depopulation meant that the land, this seemingly abundant inheritance, was functionally useless for large-scale production. It was a silent testament to the missing people, a vast, unworkable canvas where only the ghosts of the departed seemed numerous enough to fill the space. The silence wasn't just quiet. It was the sound of opportunity collapsing under the weight of absence. And that absence wasn't just about farming the land. It crept into every part of daily life. Imagine needing something fixed. The village well might crumble, its stones loose, but who had the strength, the specific knowledge, the skill to lift those heavy damp stones back into place? The fields needed endless tending, the heavy soil turned, the weeds pulled, the harvest gathered. But the hands that knew the rhythm of the plow, the touch of the soil, many were simply gone, leaving the crops to wither or the land to go fallow. That vital craftsman, the one who could fix the broken wagon wheel or sharpen the axe. Often they were just a memory now, their tools gathering dust, their workshops silent. You looked around you, and the silence wasn't just a lack of voices. It was the missing hum of work, the rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer on the anvil, the sound of laborers in the fields. All faded, leaving an unnerving quiet. You could own the land, but without hands to work it, to build, to craft, to do the things that needed doing, what did you really have? Just a constant, nagging awareness of all the things that couldn't be done. And that wasn't just a feeling, but a profound, system-wide shock. The Black Death had swept through the world, leaving behind not just graves and empty chairs, but a sudden, dramatic absence of Asterix people. Imagine, maybe a third, perhaps half, and in some ravaged places, far more of the population simply vanished. Gone. Like dust scattered on a fierce wind. This wasn't just a personal tragedy. It was an economic earthquake. Suddenly, finding someone, anyone, to plow your field, to mend your roof, to weave cloth, to hammer iron into tools, or even just to carry goods down the street, became an immense challenge. The steady rhythm of work that had pulsed through villages and towns for centuries was broken. The village blacksmith? His forge is cold. The miller at the water wheel? The wheel turns idly, grinding no grain. Think of the fields, heavy with ripe grain, swaying gently under the sun, but no scythes to be seen, no workers to bring in the harvest. The smell of potential bread, left to decay. Workshops stood silent, the faint scent of seasoned wood or tanned hides gradually fading into the stale air. Every essential task, everything that kept society fed, clothed, and sheltered, suddenly lacked the hands required to perform it. The sheer, overwhelming shortage of labor affected everything, from the grandest lord to the humblest survivor. It was a world waiting to be rebuilt, but with so few willing hands left to do the work. The silence that fell over the fields and workshops after the plague was heavy, almost palpable. With so many gone, the few hands that remained, they suddenly became precious, incredibly valuable. Imagine the survivors, stepping back into a world stripped bare, looking around at the empty spaces where neighbors and colleagues had once stood. Suddenly, a peasant farmer who had barely scraped by before the sickness found himself courted by desperate landlords. His hands, tough and calloused from a lifetime of labor, were now in high demand. He could ask for more than just bare subsistence. He could demand higher wages, perhaps a better share of the harvest, or even the right to leave the land he was tied to. The feel of a few extra coins, rough-edged and cool in his palm, was a tangible sign of this grim new power. In the towns, surviving craftsmen like blacksmiths or bakers found their skills, once common, now incredibly rare. The clang of a hammer on an anvil, or the warm, comforting smell of baking bread, were sounds and scents associated with irreplaceable expertise. They could negotiate for better pay, refuse to work for harsh masters, even pack up their tools and seek opportunity in another desperate village. This sudden, unexpected leverage, born from the immense sorrow of the plague, began to quietly, profoundly alter the very fabric of medieval society. It was a strange power indeed, built upon the graves of the lost. Picking up from the skilled workers, what about the vast majority? The simple laborers, the peasants whose backs ached from dawn till dusk in the fields. Before, their world was one of weary, unending repetition. You knew the smell of turned earth intimately, the feel of rough wool against your sun-baked skin, the relentless cycle of planting and harvest. You were tied to the land, to the manor, to the Lord whose word was law. Pay was meager, enough perhaps for a rough loaf of bread and thin stew, but little more. Asking for better wages? Unthinkable. Leaving for another manor? Often forbidden, like trying to escape your own shadow. But the plague swept through the countryside, just as ruthlessly as it did the towns. Row upon row of fields lay empty, silent. The strong hands needed to pull stubborn weeds, to scythe the ripening wheat, to mend crumbling fences. So many were gone. The lords and landowners, who had always relied on a ready supply of cheap labor, suddenly faced a terrifying scarcity. Their valuable grain, the source of their wealth and power, would simply rot in the fields if no one was there to harvest it. Now the peasant who had survived, the one still strong enough to work the soil, found themselves holding a quiet, unexpected power. Their hands, still caked with the earth of their labor, could now gesture towards a different fate. No, they might say, their voice soft but firm, not for that wage. Or, I hear they're offering 2 pennies a day, not 1, in the next valley, and I'm needed here. The smell of desperation wasn't confined to the peasants anymore. It wafted through the stone halls of the manor house. Lords fumed, trying to legislate their power back, demanding labor return to the old pitiful rates. But the simple, undeniable fact remained. The earth needed tending, and suddenly, the few who remained to tend it had found their voice. It was a quiet, grinding shift, not in grand pronouncements, but felt in the simple transaction between a lord and the laborer he suddenly couldn't afford to lose. The noble lords, the very foundations of this world, felt the ground crumbling beneath them. Their vast fields, once teeming with laborers, lay empty, quiet beneath the sun. Weeds began their slow, relentless march across furrows meant for wheat. The rents stopped coming in. The customary dues of eggs and grain ceased arriving at the manor house door. Imagine the silence there. Not the quiet peace of a full granary, but the unnerving hush of absence. The Lord would walk the drafty halls, looking out at the unused land stretching to the horizon. The source of all his wealth and power suddenly barren. This wasn't just an inconvenience. For many, it was the smell of impending ruin, the cold dread of watching their inheritance wither away acre by empty acre. And so they resisted, fiercely, stubbornly. They clung to the old ways, the old laws, like a drowning man to driftwood. They issued harsh decrees demanding labor, threatening punishment for those who left or dared ask for more than pennies. They couldn't comprehend that the old order, built on the sheer number of hands available to work the soil, had been swept away. They saw the empty fields and the insolent demands of the few remaining peasants not as an economic shift, but as a personal betrayal, a challenge to their very right to rule. This quiet struggle, manor by manor, field by field, became the new landscape of this changed world. The Lord saw betrayal, yes, in the empty fields, and the quiet demands of the few who remained. But for you, navigating this stark, new landscape, it felt different entirely. It was a fragile window, perhaps the first sliver of opportunity in a lifetime, where the old rules seemed less ironclad. You clung to this possibility, even as the lords doubled down, issuing harsh decrees from behind their newly bolted manor doors. That quiet struggle wasn't just them imposing their will, it was the survivors, fewer now but stronger in their unexpected scarcity, gently, then not so gently, pushing back. You learned to walk away from a field, the scent of turned earth still on the air, if the offer for your labor felt insultingly low. You learned the dangerous power of simply saying no, a sound that had felt utterly forbidden just months before. You might gather with your neighbors not openly in the village square where eyes might watch, but perhaps by the shallow well at dusk, the water dark and still, or hidden among the rustling leaves of the forest edge. There, voices would be hushed, whispering guarded words about fair wages, about ancient customs that might grant you unexpected rights, about the sheer unfairness of it all. These conversations, thick with nervous energy, were seeds of defiance planted in the newly empty ground. But this tension wasn't always confined to whispers and stubborn refusals. Sometimes, the pressure, heavy as a storm front rolling in over the fields, would break. A tax collector might arrive to find the village gates eerily silent and barred tight. A particularly brutal overseer might simply vanish in the darkness before dawn. Distant glows on the horizon at night spoke of manor outbuildings or even the Lord's own hall tasting flame. These weren't organized armies or grand revolutions, not yet. They were fierce, desperate flares of anger and assertion. Tremors beneath the surface, reminding the old order that the ground itself was shifting, irrevocably changed by the silence of the dead and the stubborn, defiant breath of the living. The air you breathed now tasted different, sharp with fear, and the intoxicating, dangerous possibility of something else. The air you breathed now tasted different, sharp with fear, and the intoxicating, dangerous possibility of something else. The silence of the dead didn't just leave fields empty. It left a vacuum where the old certainties used to be. The familiar rhythm of the seasons, dictated by the Lord's demands and your ancestors' obligations, felt broken. For generations, life had been etched onto the land itself. You, your parents, their parents, all bound to this particular patch, tied by tradition, by law, by the sheer weight of asterisk always having been here. Your Lord offered protection, or claimed to, and in return took your labor, your crops, your very time. It was a harsh bargain, but it was stable. It was known. But now, stability felt like a relic. With so few hands left to work the land, your labor became a suddenly precious commodity. That heavy, familiar gaze of the Lord, which used to pin you in place, seemed less certain. Could you ask for more? Could you even refuse? The terrifying thought flickered. Could you simply pack your few possessions, maybe a single pot, a worn blanket, and walk away? The roads were empty. Dangerous, yes, but perhaps less dangerous than staying in a world that no longer made sense, tied to threads that felt ready to snap. The ancient bonds, the ones that held the whole brutal system together, were stretched taut, groaning under the weight of absence. They might never fully recover. Those ancient bonds felt strained, yes, groaning under the weight of absence. But what about the oldest bond of all, the one between a person and their God? Before the plague, the church was everything. It was the solid stone in the village, the source of comfort, the explanation for suffering, the promise of something better beyond this harsh life. It felt like a warm, if sometimes stern, wool cloak against the cold, unpredictable confusion of existence. But then came the sickness, a relentless, indiscriminate wave of death that swept through homes and cathedrals alike. The holy men died in droves, their fervent prayers seemingly unanswered, their fragrant incense smoke dissipating over the stench of decay and stacked bodies. The sound of the church bell, meant to mark the hours and guide the soul, became either a constant, weary tolling of death, or perhaps more unnervingly, it fell silent altogether in villages where no one remained strong enough to pull the heavy rope. You stood amidst the desolation, surrounded by a horrifying, unnatural quiet where laughter and work sounds used to be. You looked at the empty fields, the shuttered houses, the sheer, unimaginable scale of the dying, and the simple, terrifying question began to whisper in the sudden, echoing silence. Why? Why would a just and loving God allow this widespread, agonizing suffering? Why were the good and pious taken alongside the wicked? Had God abandoned you, abandoned everyone? Had the church's comforting promises been simply empty words? It wasn't just the physical world that lay broken. The very foundation of faith, the centuries-old certainty of divine order and care, felt irrevocably shattered too. The silence from heaven felt not just empty, but profoundly deafening. This wasn't merely grief. It was a cold, existential doubt settling deep into the marrow of your bones. A new kind of ache, The faith that had anchored life for generations was suddenly adrift, lost in a vast, dark sea of sorrow and unanswered prayers. And when the old anchors of faith felt like snapped ropes, people desperately grasped for new explanations, for something, anything, to make sense of the relentless dying. If God wasn't protecting you, perhaps he was actively punishing. Perhaps the sheer scale of the horror was a sign of divine wrath unleashed, a cosmic judgment upon a sinful world. This terrifying idea took root, twisting comfort into fear. It led to frantic searches for scapegoats. Strangers, minorities, anyone different became a vessel for the perceived evil or sin that had angered the heavens. You might have witnessed the chilling spectacle of processions, groups whipping themselves raw in public, their rhythmic, self-inflicted pain, a desperate, bloody prayer for forgiveness, a performance meant to appease an imagined, furious deity watching from above. The air would hang heavy with the metallic tang of blood and the hushed, fearful murmurs of onlookers. Others saw not divine anger, but demonic corruption. The plague, they whispered, was the devil's work, a physical manifestation of evil seeping into the world. This dark belief fueled bizarre rituals and intense fear of witchcraft or dark magic, adding another layer of paranoia to an already suffocating atmosphere. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every misfortune confirmation that dark forces were at play. You lived not just with the physical threat of death, but with the constant gnawing terror of unseen enemies, both divine and demonic. Finding comfort in the world felt like finding a clean breath in a cesspool. The fear of unseen, demonic enemies was heavy, yes, adding another layer to the suffocating atmosphere that settled over everything like dust. But perhaps even more chilling, more deeply unsettling, was the quiet, persistent knowledge that the real enemy, the one that had taken your family, your friends, so many familiar faces you would never see again, wasn't truly gone. It hadn't been vanquished by prayers or rituals. It had simply withdrawn, like a terrifying tide receding only to gather strength again somewhere unseen. You had survived, yes, a small boat tossed on a terrifying sea of death. You had walked through the valley of the shadow and somehow emerged blinking into the sunlight. But that valley was still there, just over the horizon, waiting patiently. Every muffled cough heard through thin walls, every shiver that wasn't quite from the cold, every new, empty window staring back from across the lane sent a cold, sharp ripple of panic through your veins. The very air, even on a bright market day filled with the thin sounds of tentative life returning, seemed to hold a memory of the sickness, a quiet, invisible threat that clung to the edges of sound and light. The streets were emptier now, lined with houses that felt too quiet, too still. The silence in your own home, after the chaos and the grief, was deeper than any silence had ever been before the sickness came. And in that silence, in the quiet hours before dawn or during the long afternoons, you could almost hear the plague waiting, just out of sight, unseen, but undeniably present. You looked at your neighbors, the handful of familiar faces left, fellow survivors, and saw not the relief of escape, but a shared, silent understanding. You hadn't defeated the darkness. You were merely living in its temporary absence, granted perhaps by chance or fate, or something else entirely unknowable. It was a breath held, indefinitely, waiting for the next wave to crash. The world felt permanently altered, fragile now, like beautiful but cracked porcelain that could shatter at any moment. The warmth of the sun didn't fully banish the internal chill that settled deep in your bones. You lived not with the simple, unadulterated joy of having escaped death, but with the quiet, gnawing certainty that its shadow was just behind you, patient, always ready to return without warning, perhaps tomorrow, perhaps next year, perhaps in your children's time. Sleep came hard, sometimes, filled with ghosts in the quiet corners of the mind, and the distant, phantom memory of church bells that had once tolled endlessly for the dead. Yes, the bells eventually ceased their mournful toll, but the silence that followed was often far more unsettling. It was a quiet filled not with peace, but with absence. For those who had walked through the valley of the shadow and emerged, the world felt irrevocably altered. Your body, perhaps scarred by boils or simply weakened by the ordeal, remained a fragile vessel, every cough or fever a terrifying echo of the sickness that had claimed so many. The constant, quiet fear of its return was a heavy cloak you wore day and night. But beyond the personal fear, there was the pervasive emptiness. Walk through your village. Where are the neighbors who shared your burdens, the friends who laughed beside you? The streets are too wide now, the houses too many and too silent. The smell of wood smoke is thinner, the sounds of daily life muted. Fields lie fallow, not for lack of sun or rain, but for lack of hands to work them. This wasn't just personal grief. It was the collective trauma of a generation, living in a world defined by what was lost, trying to rebuild life in the vast, echoing space left behind by the dead. It was a quiet, persistent ache, a knowledge that you had survived into a fundamentally broken place. NNT, thank you for joining us on Plotfall. Until our next story, may your thoughts be calm and your rest deep.